Tonight, we begin with something quieter, something sacred, not rushed or loud but steady, like footsteps across desert sand. This is the story of 40 days that changed eternity, a journey into silence, temptation, and divine strength. Before the miracles, before the crowds, before the cross, there was wilderness. So wherever you are in the world, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments, and let's begin this unfolding together. The sky stretched wide over the Jordan, golden with the soft light of a setting sun, and the river still shimmered from the ripples of his baptism. The voice had already come. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. But the crowd was gone now, the moment passed, and the Spirit, gentle but unwavering, pressed upon him not toward thrones or cities, but toward the wilderness. There was no path carved in the dust, no signs nailed to trees, no echo of applause to follow him there, just wind, wide silence, and the sound of sandals brushing against the rocks as Jesus walked alone. The air was dry, stretched thin by heat and quiet, and the hills loomed ahead like ancient bones rising from the sand. And still, he walked. This was not a place of comfort. This was not the temple or the table or the streets of Galilee. This was solitude stretched across stone and thorn. This was hunger waiting behind every breath. This was obedience that moved without question. And so he walked deeper into the absence of noise, into the vast, wild nothing where the sky meets the ground, in a silence so thick it presses on the chest. He wasn't lost. He wasn't wandering. He was led by the Spirit, the same Spirit that had hovered over the waters in the beginning, the same Spirit that descended like a dove just days ago, the same Spirit that now whispered not with comfort, but with clarity. This is where strength is shaped. This is where sonship is tested, not in the brightness of miracles, but in the dull ache of thirst, in the long stretch of days without voice or vision. For 40 days, he would be here, not to prove something to the world, but to align everything within himself to the Father's will. Each step in the sand would be an echo of Israel's wandering, but unlike them, he would not turn to idols. Unlike them, he would not grumble. Unlike them, he would not doubt the presence that remains, even when bread is nowhere to be found. This was not exile. This was not punishment. This was preparation. And still, he walked deeper into the quiet, into the sacred thinning of self, where heaven and earth begin to blur, and the soul stands stripped of all but the voice of God. The wind picked up across the stones, whispering through the figless branches like a memory too old to name, and the sky above him opened not with thunder, but with silence, heavy and holy, and he did not speak, not yet. For sometimes the strength of the Savior is not first revealed in words, but in the stillness of a heart that listens, waits, and hungers for the will of the Father more than the satisfaction of the flesh. And so, the wilderness opened wide around him, and Jesus, the beloved Son, stepped forward without fear, not to escape the world, but to stand alone with it, to face the very hunger and lies it offers, and to answer not with argument, but with truth breathed from ancient scrolls and eternal love. The wilderness would not break him, it would reveal him. The desert morning did not wake with birdsong or bustling life, but with a stillness so thick it felt like a second skin, a kind of hush that settled on every stone, every thorned bush, every shadow that bent across the baked earth like a long memory stretched thin. And Jesus rose with it, the dust clinging to his feet, his breath steady, measured, drawn in slowly from the dry air that had already begun to warm beneath the clouds. though the weight of the day ahead pressed close, he did not flinch or hurry or retreat, for this was the rhythm of surrender, the quiet cadence of a will aligned not with comfort, but with calling. And the first true hunger had begun to stir now. Not just the mild discomfort that comes with skipped meals, but the deep, yawning ache that echoes through the hollow places of the body. The kind of hunger that wraps around the ribs and tugs with each breath. And yet he bore it not with grimace or groan, but with stillness. His silence not weakness, but an offering. A defiant kind of devotion that whispers, "Man does not live by bread alone," even before the words have yet to be spoken aloud. And as he walked farther across the rocks, his sandals now worn thin at the edges, each step stirred faint clouds of dust behind him, trails that led nowhere but deeper into solitude. And the wilderness gave nothing in return, no oasis, no secret provision, no comfort beyond the vastness of the horizon and the sun, which now sat higher in the sky, like a watchman whose gaze cannot be avoided. And the hunger spoke louder now, not in words, but in the subtle shifts of the body, the way the stomach pulled inward, the way the mouth grew dry, the way even the scent of unseen fruit seemed to haunt the wind, like temptation wearing the robe of memory. And still he did not yield. Instead, he turned inward, into the sacred depth where the spirit resides, into the quiet dialogue that had begun long before this desert opened itself to him. For the Son did not enter the wilderness to test the Father, but to obey him. And the hunger became something holy, not an enemy to be banished, but a threshold to be crossed, a veil through which deeper strength could be revealed. And as the hours passed, and the sun carved shadows longer across the stone, Jesus found shade beneath a crooked tree, whose leaves rattled like dry bones in the breeze, and he knelt there, not from weakness, but from purpose, the position of surrender not forced but chosen. For the greatest strength is often shown in stillness, and the first day of hunger gave way to the first night of solitude, and the stars appeared above him, not in chaotic bursts, but in slow unveiling, one by one, as if the heavens themselves remembered who sat beneath them, and the cold crept in with the dark, the kind of cold that makes the bones remember they are dust. And yet he did not seek fire or shelter, for this wilderness was not meant to comfort him. It was meant to shape him, to burn away every ounce of dependence on the visible, so that only the invisible remained. And in that sacred night, as his breath fogged in the air, as his body began the quiet work of endurance, his spirit grew louder, not with noise, but with presence. And the hunger, once sharp and intrusive, now became familiar, a companion in the silence, a reminder that the flesh may ache, but the spirit will rise. And somewhere beyond the hills, the tempter watched, waiting, patient, knowing that flesh weakens with each hour, hoping perhaps that the Son would lose his resolve, would trade eternal purpose for momentary satisfaction. But he did not yet approach, for temptation does not always strike early. It waits until the bones feel hollow, until the silence becomes deafening, until the soul feels wrapped in shadow. And still Jesus waited, not passively, but actively surrendered. His thoughts turned inward and upward, his prayers silent but ceaseless, his heart tethered to the Father like a vine to the root, unbroken, unshaken. And when morning broke again, it did not arrive with fanfare, just a pale blue stretch across the sky, and the gentle warmth of light that gave no promise of ease. And so began the second day, and the hunger did not fade. It deepened. A slow burn now settled in his limbs, a weariness that curled beneath the skin like smoke rising from a smouldering fire. And yet he moved forward, farther into the wilderness, deeper into obedience. And the world did not see it, did not marvel or follow. For some of the greatest acts of strength are done in the unseen places, where only God watches, and the earth beneath his feet held no footprints ahead of him, only the ones he left behind. And the hunger sang louder still, but so did the resolve, the peace that surpasses understanding, the quiet. Knowledge that though the flesh may cry out, the spirit was being fed by a word older than stone, stronger than hunger, and more faithful than the rising sun. The desert sun lifted slowly again over the distant edge of earth, casting long golden spears across the sand, like the quiet opening of heaven's eyelid, and with it, the third day began, not marked by a calendar or celebration, but by the deepening hush of sacred stillness that only those who wait in the wilderness truly understand. And Jesus stirred beneath the same brittle tree, whose branches now whispered stories in the wind, not in human tongues, but in the rustle of leaves worn thin from years of silence. And he did not speak, not aloud, for there was nothing to say that had not already been poured out in the long conversation of obedience and trust, and the ache of hunger curled tighter around his ribs, a constant pressure not sharp but steady, like a river cutting through rock, not with violence but with time. And even so, his eyes opened soft to the sky, his breath slowed, deep, centered not in survival but in surrender. For each new day in the wilderness was not a challenge to overcome, but a chapter in the divine unfolding of a soul, laid bare before the Father. And while the world moved on somewhere far away, bustling in temples and towns, unaware of the sacred silence echoing in the hills beyond the Jordan, Jesus remained hidden in plain sight, his presence touching nothing and yet pressing into everything. For there is a kind of power that speaks, not through thunder, but through the deliberate absence of noise. And it was in this silence that he listened, not for angels, nor for visions, nor for affirmations, but simply for the will of the one who had led him here. And in that listening, something unseen shifted, not around him, but within him. For true wilderness does not just empty the body, it reveals the soul. And in the revelation, the whispers come, not always loud or clear, but deep, deep, threaded through the marrow like songs too ancient to forget. And as he rose, his steps light but purposeful, he moved over the jagged earth like breath itself, unnoticed, yet completely alive. And the rocks beneath his feet bore witness, for he was retracing not only Israel's history, but humanity's story, the testing of trust, the question of enough, the choice between presence and provision. And though his stomach cried out, though his tongue grew dry, though his strength was drawn now from wells deeper than the flesh, he walked not in defeat but in fullness, the kind that comes not from what you hold in your hands, but from what you refuse to surrender in your heart. And the silence stretched on, a canvas painted with shadows and heat, and still no voice from heaven, no relief, no manna falling from the sky. And yet he did not grow bitter, for he knew that the absence of comfort does not equal the absence of God. And the hunger that grew louder with each hour became not an enemy but a gate, one that ushered him farther beyond the illusion that sustains most men, into the core truth that to live is not merely to eat or to drink, but to be aligned utterly and completely with the will of the Father. And it was here, on this third day, as the shadows shortened and the heat pressed low, that the silence began to hum, not with noise, but with presence, the kind that can only be heard by those who have let go of everything else. And he sat once again on a stone smoothed by centuries of wind, the story unfolding far beyond the desert, the people who would one day follow him, not just to the waters of baptism, but into their own wildernesses, and he understood the cost, the weight of it, the burden of being both son and servant, both sacrifice and savior. And yet he did not turn away. For every silent hour was a declaration that he would not choose comfort over calling, that he would not trade identity for appetite, that he would not leave the wilderness until every part of his being was aligned, until every shadow of doubt had been swallowed by the light of perfect surrender. And so he remained, and the silence grew deeper and yet somehow richer, like a symphony that can only be heard by ears no longer distracted by the noise of the world. And his fingers ran along the cracks in the stone beside him, and he closed his eyes not in weariness, but in worship, not the loud kind, but the kind that breathes, that waits, that loves without needing anything in return. And this was the third day, and already the wilderness had taken much. But what it gave back was weightier still. Clarity, intimacy, trust, a foundation upon which miracles would later stand. And the tempter, watching still, knew the time drew near, but even he could feel it. The silence that speaks, the presence that steadies, the holiness of a hunger that will not bend to. Fear. The fourth day began not with fanfare or change, not with sudden visions or divine interruptions, but with the same dry wind pulling softly at his garments and the sun rising slow across the dust-strewn horizon like it had for millennia before. And Jesus, now deeper in the wilderness than most men would ever dare to walk, woke not with alarm but with calm, his limbs weary but not shaken, his soul tethered to the invisible rhythm that pulsed beneath every step, every breath, every silence that had stretched from the Jordan to this nameless desert terrain. And though the hunger continued its low and relentless thrum, though thirst curled at the edges of his mouth like a shadow that would not leave, he did not reach for remedy, for he had come to taste this very ache, not out of masochism or penance, but out of pure obedience. And the wilderness around him was beginning to shift, not physically, but perceptibly, the way a familiar place begins to feel unfamiliar after time stretches too long in its company. And the rocks, once only scenery, now seemed to bear witness, their stillness echoing the inner weight he carried, the heaviness of being fully man while also carrying the fullness of God. And every stone, every grain of sand seemed to echo back a deeper question. Who are you really, Son of God? Not from heaven, not yet from the lips of a tempter, but from within, the kind of question that emerges not from doubt, but from preparation. For identity is not simply claimed in public, but tested in silence. And the silence of this fourth day was heavier, as though the desert had drawn its breath and was waiting, and Jesus, unhurried, allowed it to wait, for he had no need to rush through this discomfort, no need to bypass the ache, for he knew that the stones that now surrounded him would one day echo his name from temple walls, that the dust now clinging to his robe would one day bear witness to the blood he would shed for those who could never endure this kind of wilderness alone. And so he sat, allowing the ache to deepen, allowing the questions to rise, and in that rising, he did not fear, for he had nothing to prove, only something to fulfill, and the fulfillment would not come through shortcuts or spectacle, but through the slow, sacred laying down of every comfort, every claim to self, every earthly remedy that could ease the weight but rob the mission. And as he looked out over the stones, the ones glistening with heat like coals in the sunlight, the thought may have flickered, bred, but he did not reach for the thought, did not entertain the possibility, for even the power to create must submit to the will of the Father. And what good is bread gained through disobedience if it crumbles the very foundation of purpose? And so he watched the light dance on the rocks, felt the heat climb again, felt the hunger tug again, and still he waited, not with passive endurance, but with sacred defiance, the kind that refuses to allow the body's scream to outweigh the spirit's whisper. And the sky above remained unchanged, brilliant and indifferent, and the creatures of the desert moved only in shadow, avoiding the harshness of the heat that now bent across the terrain like an unseen weight. And in this silence, in this emptiness, something sacred was forming, not an escape from the world, but a deeper readiness to enter it, to bear it, to redeem it. And each beat of his heart became a drum of defiance against every lie that would later be spoken, against every temptation that would try to twist his hunger into doubt. And as the day pressed on, the shadows grew longer again, and Jesus stood once more, the ground beneath his feet cracking faintly with the dryness of long years without rain. And still he walked, not toward shelter, not toward shade, but toward the deeper places of solitude. And in that walk, the wilderness whispered again, not with accusation, but with invitation, to know, to trust, to lay down even the right to be comforted in order to be fully available to the will of the Father. And he did not resist it, for he knew that the wilderness was not exile, it was encounter, and the silence was not absence. It was the language of shaping, and every grain of sand, every breath, every heartbeat in this fourth day was preparing him not only for the temptation that would come, but for the cross that would follow. And so he kept walking, deeper into the ache, deeper into the trust, deeper into the story already written long before the stones began to speak. The fifth day came with no less clarity, no shift in the sun's path, no break in the silent rhythm of wilderness breath, but something unseen stirred in the air around him now, like a shadow moving behind the veil of heat, a watching presence that did not yet speak but hovered just beyond the corner of awareness, not in the physical realm alone, but in that deeper space where temptation waits for permission to enter. And Jesus, still silent, still fasting, still walking among the rocks and thorn bushes and the brittle remains of forgotten waterbeds, could feel it pressing closer, not in fear, for fear had no hold on him, but in recognition, for he knew the patterns of the enemy, knew the twisting nature of lies wrapped in partial truth, and he knew also that the voice which waits to whisper often does so not in the first days of resolve, but in the slow unraveling of the body when the mind begins to bargain and the flesh begins to plead. And so he remained alert, though his eyes closed often in prayer, though his voice did not rise, and the wilderness around him, though unchanged in appearance, had become a theatre of waiting, of convergence between the eternal and the fallen, between the ancient memory of a garden and the present ache of the desert. And he, this second Adam, stood not beneath the branches of temptation, but beneath the weight of raw obedience. And where the first had failed, he would not, but the cost would be everything. And the silence that had so far been his ally now began to shift, as if charged with the breath of something else entirely, a coiling presence moving across the stones, perhaps in the form of thought, perhaps in atmosphere, but unmistakably real. And the hunger within him was now sharp, hollowing him from the inside with a grip that would have bent the knees of any other man. But Jesus bore it still, his body thinning, his skin drawn tight across the frame of bone and sinew, yet his spirit ablaze with resolve that could not be undone by need or deceit. And he stood once more among the dry ravines and jagged cliffs of the high desert, looking outward across the desolation, not with despair, but with the gaze of one who sees beyond. And though the world might think this place was empty, he knew it was thick with eternity, that this wilderness was not abandonment. It was a battleground, not of swords and shields, but of identity and trust. And he had not come here to win an argument, but to remain unshaken, to let the enemy speak and not yield, to let the flesh cry out and not answer, to let the hunger reach its full depth and still say, "It is written." And so he stood there, unmoved, even as the darkness slithered nearer, not in form but in strategy, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, not when the body is strongest, but when it's thinnest, when the lines between want and weakness blur, when the long hours of stillness make the mind wonder whether the silence will ever break. And yet Jesus, the Son, the Word made flesh, knew the silence well, had lived in it since before the stars were born. And though the enemy would try to twist it into abandonment, he knew better. He knew that the silence of the Father is not absence, but trust, the kind of trust that does not need to shout to be sure. And he remembered, even here, the voice that came from the river. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And though that voice had not echoed since the Jordan, it had not vanished, and he carried it like a seal upon his soul, the anchor that would hold him steady, even when the darkness came speaking in the light. And the fifth day drew on, sun overhead, heat merciless, and still he did not falter. Though his body burned and his tongue dried and his bones ached beneath the weight of fasting, for his hunger was now not just for food, but for righteousness, not just for water, but for the will of the Father to be fulfilled through him completely. And the stones that lined the valley floor now shimmered in the afternoon haze, tempting the eye. But he did not look at them with desire. He looked through them, and he saw what others could not, that miracles done outside of obedience are just illusions, and that the real victory is not in turning stones to bread, but in trusting that bread will come in its appointed time. And he waited, and the darkness watched, and the sky rolled overhead like a slow wave of time, and his hands curled softly at his sides, not clenched but steady, and his heart beat not in panic but in purpose. And so the day passed, and the enemy lingered near, waiting for the cracks to widen, waiting for the right breath, the perfect opening, the precise hunger that might convince even the sun to grasp rather than receive. And though the serpent did not yet speak, his coil was tightening. And Jesus knew, and still he chose the silence, chose the ache, chose the wilderness over the shortcut. And in that choosing, the world would never be the same. The sixth day dawned with the same quiet indifference as the 5 before it, the sun rising without haste, casting long shadows across the jagged hills and cracked earth of the Judean wilderness, as if time itself had slowed to a contemplative crawl. And Jesus, now gaunt but not weakened in spirit, stood at the edge of a narrow ridge, where the ground fell away into a basin of dust and fractured stone. The air around him still thick with the unseen tension of a presence that had yet to speak, but had begun to settle in like mist gathering in the low places. And the silence was no longer merely absence. It pulsed now with a kind of anticipation, as if the very rocks underfoot were holding their breath. And still he waited, his body a landscape of obedience carved by hunger, thirst, and the ache of surrender. And the voice within, the one tethered not to flesh but to eternity, remained steady, unwavering, not rising in resistance, but settled in the kind of peace that only comes when every desire has been laid on the altar. And the wind stirred, dry and sharp, lifting fine grains of sand that whispered against his skin like ghosts of past wanderers, of Israelite feet that had once faltered on this very ground, feet that had danced in freedom and stumbled in complaint. that had seen manna fall from heaven and yet ask for more, for signs, for guarantees, for gods they could touch. But he, this son, this new Adam, this holy lamb, asked for nothing but presence, for alignment, for the will of the Father to move through him like breath through lungs. And the stones glittered again beneath his gaze, their rough edges catching the light in a way that made them appear almost edible, like bread left in the sun, and the hunger twisted once more in his stomach, a deep, dull pull that reached from gut to bone. And still he did not move, and still he did not speak. And the tempter, waiting, coiling, tasting the moment, felt the time draw near. For temptation is not just a test of appetite. It is a test of memory, of identity, of resolve. And the longer the hunger persists, the easier it becomes to forget the voice from the river, to forget the dove descending, to forget the heavens torn open in affirmation, and to listen instead to the whisper of stones that say, feed yourself, that say, prove your worth, that say, if you are who you claim to be, then why suffer in silence? But Jesus did not forget, not even for a breath, for the word was alive within him, woven into the sinews of his being. And when he closed his eyes against the bright press of daylight, he could still hear it, not as echo, but as presence, as living rhythm. Man does not live by bread alone, and the rocks did not transform, for he would not demand miracles from a Father who had already given everything. And the sixth day wore on with a heat that pressed into the shoulders, into the soles of his feet, into the breath that grew shallower with each hour, and the silence around him now crackled with expectancy, the darkness moving at the edges of light, circling, waiting for the moment when suggestion might become strategy. And the stones, those ever-present companions of the desert, no longer seemed inert but watchful, almost sentient, like witnesses to a drama unfolding beyond the perception of ordinary men. And they whispered still, turn us, use us, eat and be full. And yet he would not speak, not yet, for the discipline of silence was its own shield, and the restraint of power its own declaration of sovereignty. And he remembered the wilderness stories, the manna, the water from rock, the serpents and the bronze staff, the commandments carved in stone. And he knew this wilderness too was holy ground, not because it provided, but because it purified. And as the day slipped into evening once more, and the sky bled red behind the hills, the hunger became a living thing inside him, and yet he welcomed it, named it not as enemy, but as fire that refines, a shadow that sharpens light. And he knelt once more on the hard ground, his fingers brushing over the roughness of a nearby stone. And the contact grounded him, not in the material, but in the purpose of being fully present, fully yielded. And still he waited, for the enemy would come soon. He could feel it, could sense the questions forming, the challenge to identity clothed in logic, the seduction of self-reliance masquerading as strength. But he was not afraid, for fear is the fruit of uncertainty, and he was certain, not of outcome, not of ease, but of who he was and to whom he belonged. And the wilderness around him, though still and dry and empty of all comfort, was rich now with meaning, with memory, with mission. And as the stars returned one by one, blinking gently into the velvet sky, Jesus lifted his gaze, not in search of escape, but in communion. And the stones, though unchanged, seemed somehow quieter, as if even they had heard the resolve in his silence and knew they would remain stones. For the bread of life would not be conjured by demand, but given in perfect time. By the seventh day, the desert had wrapped itself around him completely, not only with its dry winds and endless horizons of broken stone and brittle shrubs, but with its silence, a silence so thick and encompassing that it seemed to move with him, to follow him like a second shadow stretching from his feet in the sun's glare. And though his body was now thin with fasting, and his skin pulled taut by the sun and wind, he moved as one fully inhabited, not by weariness, but by unwavering intention. And the stillness in the air had changed, almost imperceptibly, as if something was gathering behind the veil of the visible, something ancient, something cunning. And Jesus could feel it, like pressure building before a storm, not in the sky, but in the spirit, a tightening around the edges of thought and atmosphere that signaled the moment was near, the moment when the enemy would stop circling and speak. And as he descended into a shallow ravine where the heat seemed to press in from all directions, even the stones radiating with a stifling breath, the voice came, not from outside, not yet, but from within, in the form of a question wrapped in suggestion, a whisper that wore the voice of logic and comfort and even familiarity. And it said, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread." And the words did not shock him, for he had known they would come, had expected them, had waited for them, and yet still they pierced, not because they held truth, but because they reflected the oldest lie, that one's identity must be proven through power, through provision, through the satisfaction of hunger rather than the stillness of trust. And Jesus stood among the burning rocks, his lips dry, his limbs aching, his stomach a hollow ache that echoed louder with each breath. And he did not respond with anger or debate or explanation, for the truth does not need to argue, it simply is. And so he said, with a voice steady and slow, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." And the words fell not just into the air, but into the atmosphere itself, like stones into a deep well, reverberating through the silence with a power the enemy could not touch. And the voice withdrew, not gone, but shifting, retreating only to circle again. For temptation is rarely defeated in a single blow. It morphs, it adapts, it waits for new angles. And Jesus knew the voice would return, perhaps with different clothing, perhaps with a sharper edge. And so he climbed from the ravine, his hands grazing the sides of the rock, his breath now labored from days without food. And as he reached the top, the wind picked up, hot and harsh, sweeping across the landscape in fits, as if stirred by more than weather. And the stones beneath his feet now felt charged, as though they remembered the voice too, as though the entire desert had become an altar upon which something eternal was being offered, not with blood, not with flames, but with the sheer weight of unbroken trust. And he walked again, not away from the voice, but deeper into the wilderness, deeper into the place where self-reliance must die so that divine obedience can live. And the hunger that clawed at his insides no longer felt like suffering, but like sharpening, like the grindstone against which the blade of his purpose was being honed. And though the voice would return, and it would, with promises of rescue, of glory, of dominion, he had already chosen not just once, but again and again, with each breath, with each denial of ease, with each refusal to grasp what was not given. And this was the seventh day, and still he had not eaten, had not drunk, had not sought signs or demanded comfort. And the earth did not shake, and the angels did not descend, but something had changed in the wilderness, a shift in the unseen, a movement in the fabric of resistance. For when the Son of God says no to the lie, the earth remembers Eden, and the serpent is forced to recalculate, and Jesus walked on, not because the voice had been silenced, but because he had not, because his yes to the Father was louder than every whisper of doubt. And the desert watched, and the stones remained stones, and heaven did not break open again, but the world tilted quietly on its axis, for a man had stared down hunger, stared down identity games, stared down the shadow of temptation, and chosen instead to trust in silence what the Father had spoken in light. And he walked into the next stretch of wilderness, not with the certainty of food or safety, but with the fire of truth burning in his bones. And the voice would come again, but so would the answer, and the answer would never change. Not here, not on a rooftop, not on a mountaintop, not in a garden or a courtroom, or a cross, for he had chosen once and for all, not my will, but yours be done. The 8th day in the wilderness was not marked by the appearance of storms or the breaking of skies, but by the slow intensifying of something both subtle and sacred, as though the desert itself were drawing tighter around him, whispering of trials yet to come, of battles not with sword or flesh, but with shadows dressed in scripture and lies painted to resemble truth. And Jesus, still thin from hunger but unwavering in resolve, knew that the voice which had come on the 7th day would not remain silent. For temptation, when rebuffed, does not retreat forever. It waits, it observes, it recalibrates, and the next test would not be about appetite, but about identity, about security, about whether trust could survive the silence of heaven and the threat of the fall. And even as he walked over the worn terrain, his sandals frayed, his bones aching beneath the stretch of sun-darkened skin, his spirit remained steady, fed by something no eye could see, no hand could hold, and in the stillness he could sense it, the shift in air, the tightening of spiritual gravity, the slow unveiling of the second voice, now rising from suggestion to spectacle, from hunger to pride. And then it came, not in thunder, but in imagination, in vision, in the offering of a moment so theatrical it echoed with danger disguised as faith, and suddenly was not in the desert, but standing on the pinnacle of the temple, the sacred structure rising beneath him like a monument to man's need for proximity to God, the courtyard stretching far below, the streets filled with the movement of people unaware that eternity balanced now on the edge of stone. And beside him, the voice spoke again, this time more bold, more cunning, laced with scripture that bent like light through water, distorted yet familiar. If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you. They will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. And the words were sweetened with false reverence, their roots tangled in truth but twisted toward pride. For the test was not truly about protection. It was about performance, about whether the Son would demand proof, would call down spectacle to validate identity, and the temple beneath him stood as a symbol of the very thing he now resisted, the temptation to use God rather than to trust him. And Jesus, standing high above the sacred city in the vision not of his own making, did not look down with fear, but with clarity. And though his body trembled from the weight of fasting and the echo of dizzying height, his voice did not waver. It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. And with that, the vision cracked like glass hit by thunder, and he was once again in the wilderness, the stones beneath his feet, the sky above burning with the steady fire of another midday sun. And the silence returned, not empty, but filled with the echo of resistance, and the enemy, having struck twice and failed, pulled back once more, but not in defeat, for pride wounded does not vanish. It strategizes, it waits for the next weakness. And Jesus, alone again in the dry wilderness, knew that this silence too was sacred, that this second temptation had been a mirror not of trust, but of mistrust. an invitation to test God's love, to manipulate divine promise into divine performance. But love does not demand spectacle, and trust does not require proof. And the Son, the Word incarnate, had no need to leap in order to know that angels stood ready, had no need to fall in order to believe the Father's hand would catch him. And so he chose instead the path of unglamorous obedience, the way of quiet surrender, and the wilderness accepted his answer with no applause, no sign, only more silence, more heat, more hunger. But inside him the ground grew stronger, like roots digging deeper through dry soil, drawing life not from surface water, but from the depths of eternal communion. And as the sun began to dip once more below the ridges of scorched hills, casting shadows long and golden across the silent land, Jesus remained, the only voice still his own, unbent, unbroken, anchored not in outward proof, but in inward peace. And the temple, though far away now in vision, would soon be near again in life. And again he would refuse the spectacle, and again he would surrender, not to prove who he was, but because he knew whose he was. And the eighth night fell like a cloak, and the stars blinked back into being, and he lay under them with nothing in his hands but everything in his heart. And the enemy withdrew into the folds of shadow, planning still, waiting for one last attempt, while heaven watched not in worry, but in wonder, for never had such strength been displayed. In such stillness, never had such power been revealed through such restraint, and the wilderness held its breath as the Son of God slept, hungry but whole, unseen but unstoppable. The 11th day did not rise with ceremony or sudden transformation. No beam of light split the sky to announce his next steps, and yet something essential had changed, not in the dust beneath his feet or the stones that still pressed sharply into his soles, but in the air around him and the silence within. For Jesus was no longer simply enduring the wilderness. He had become part of it, and it part of him. And now, after facing down the adversary not with argument, but with truth, not with force, but with fidelity, he stood not merely as one who had resisted, but as one who had been refined. And in the stillness of the early dawn, as faint traces of blue washed across the eastern edge of the desert, he began to move, not with haste, not with exhaustion, but with quiet intention. For he knew the path forward would not be lined with ease, and though the tempter had withdrawn, the greater trial had only begun. For now he would walk not toward solitude, but into the world of men, into the noise of need and the ache of expectation, into the crowds who would cheer and challenge, follow and betray, lift him up and cast him down. And though his body was still recovering, still marked by the hollowness of fasting, his spirit had never been more full. And with each step he took back toward the towns and rivers, toward the synagogues and homes and broken streets, he carried not only the victory of silence over spectacle, but the burden of knowing what must come. And as he descended from the jagged heights, the land unfolded before him, dry plains giving way to paths worn by travelers, the far-off curve of civilization beginning to take shape like the outline of prophecy itself. And he felt it, not with dread but with solemn clarity, that the very people he came to redeem would be the ones who did not understand, that the miracles they sought would never satisfy the hunger they truly carried, that the freedom he offered would be too weightless for those still shackled to power. And yet he walked, not away from them, but toward them, not in anger, but in love, and with each mile, each breath drawn through lips cracked by sun and sand, he remembered the words of Isaiah, the vision of the suffering servant, the promise of the one who would bear our griefs and carry our sorrows. And he knew he was that one. And this return was not the end of trial, but the beginning of a journey that would stretch from mountain to sea, from village to temple, from laughter to weeping, to betrayal to blood. And as he neared the edge of the wilderness, the place where the wild land kissed the first hints of cultivated life, he paused, not for rest, but for reverence. For he knew this boundary well. It was the place where many turned back, where conviction faltered in the face of cost. But he had not come to turn back. And as he crossed over from solitude into society, from obscurity into the ache of the public eye, he was greeted not by crowds but by silence, not by fanfare but by wind rustling in the tall grasses. And yet heaven watched, for the Son was stepping fully into his mission now, no longer cloaked in the anonymity of wilderness wandering but clothed in the weight of purpose. And though he would soon call disciples, would soon teach on hillsides and heal with a touch and challenge rulers with nothing but words, he would carry within him always the quiet of these 40 days, the clarity of temptation resisted, the strength that comes not from what is seen but from what is surrendered. And he would need that strength, for ahead lay rejection deeper than the desert, betrayal sharper than any wilderness thorn, and suffering no fast could prepare the flesh to endure. And yet he would walk forward anyway, because love does not require ease to remain faithful, and truth does not waver in the face of resistance. And as he moved into the first village, a quiet place with dust-covered paths and curious eyes, he did not announce himself with thunder, did not raise his voice with declarations, but began with presence, with listening, with looking into the eyes of fishermen and laborers and widows and children. And though they did not yet know, they would soon see, and some would believe and some would flee. But all would be offered the same invitation, to follow, to be transformed, to carry the weight of a kingdom not built by force but by faith. And the wilderness, now behind him, did not fade from memory. It burned within him, an ember that would never go out, a reminder of who he was and who he came to be. And though the road ahead would wind through storms and trials, through gardens of sweat and crosses of shame, he would not waver, for he had stood when all comfort had been stripped away, and had remained when all voices but the Father's had gone silent. And so he would walk forward now, not just as rabbi or prophet, but as the Lamb who would be slain, the shepherd who would seek the lost, the king who would wear no crown but thorns. And as the people began to murmur, to look, to wonder who this man was, Jesus kept walking, each step echoing the sacred rhythm that had begun in the wilderness. Not my will, but yours be done. Though he had stepped beyond the dry borders of the wilderness did not leave him, for its lessons were etched deeper than flesh, carved into the fabric of his thoughts, woven into his gaze, and every step he took into the world of men was now traced with the echo of silence, of hunger, of the tempter's voice and the power of refusal. And Jesus, though now among people, did not move like one who had merely emerged from solitude, but like one who had wrestled in the unseen, who had touched the edge of human frailty and remained whole. And as he walked through the narrow alleys of the first village, through streets choked with dust and shaded only by the occasional lean-to or olive tree, he moved with the poise of one who knew where he was going, even if no one around him yet understood the path. And the people watched, eyes peering from behind pottery stalls, children pausing their games of dust and pebble, women looking up from woven baskets, as this stranger with desert-worn robes and sun-darkened features passed. And though he said little, there was something in him that quieted their souls, something that disturbed their assumptions without uttering a word. For in him the wilderness still whispered, and it whispered of something different, something not shaped by Roman rule or temple tradition, something deeper than the rituals and older than the scrolls. And he stopped at wells and greeted strangers, not with grandeur but with gentleness. And his eyes, those eyes that had seen the kingdoms of the world offered as a lie, looked now with a clarity that pierced through appearances, and those who met his gaze felt, if only for a moment, that they had been known fully, not exposed to shame but invited into something sacred. And he moved from village to village, the path unwritten yet unfolding. Each town unaware that the fulfillment of prophecies long memorized was now passing through their gates. And though he did not yet speak publicly of what had occurred in the wilderness, it clung to him like fragrance after oil, like the scent of fire in the folds of a robe. And those attuned to spirit could sense it, though they could not name it, that this man carried within him not just conviction, but completion. Not just knowledge, but the weight of having refused what most men chase all their lives. And in the evenings, when the towns grew quiet and the fires burned low, he often walked alone, not because he feared the people, but because he carried something they could not yet hold. And he spoke with the Father in whispers, not always with words, but with presence, with silence that matched the cadence of heaven. And he remembered each stone, each shadow, each question posed by the enemy. And more than that, each time he said no, not to deny himself life, but to offer the world a new one. And though the days passed now among noise and laughter and need, he still rose early before the dawn, to walk in the hills, to find places where the wind could sing and the earth could remember who he was. And there he prayed, not for signs or strength, but simply to remain aligned, to stay tuned to the voice that had spoken love over him at the river and had guided him through every barren mile. And in those quiet hours, the wilderness still spoke, not with fear, but with gratitude, for it had been transformed from a place of isolation into a place of consecration. And now, as he began to call those who would walk with him, fishermen and tax collectors, zealots and doubters, he did so, not from a place of command, but from companionship, inviting them into the kind of life forged not in palaces or schools, but in deserts. And they did not yet understand what it meant to leave their nets, to follow one whose kingdom would look nothing like Rome or even Jerusalem. But they followed because something in him felt truer than what they'd known. And the wilderness inside him began to shape them too. Not through hardship at first, but through presence, through example, through the simple consistency of one who lived what he preached, who turned no one away, who did not hurry, who met eyes and held them, who saw not only lepers and beggars, but children and widows and the wealthy, who wept behind their titles. And still he carried the silence with him, the kind that settles deep inside and cannot be broken by noise. And the temptations that had once come with fanfare and fire now came in whispers. Through the admiration of crowds, the invitations to political alliance, the subtle suggestions to speed up the plan or prove himself again. But he refused again and again, not just because of what he had endured in the wilderness, but because of who he had become through it. And every miracle he performed was not an act of power for its own sake, but a continuation of surrender, an extension of the same obedience that said no to the stones becoming bread, and yes to the unseen word of God. And the people marveled, not just at his works, but at the way he walked, the way he did not rush or demand or manipulate. And though some expected him to rise quickly, to confront Rome, to seize the temple, he remained on the long road, the narrow one, the path that led not to a throne of gold, but to a garden of blood and a hill of suffering. And all along the way, the wilderness echoed within him, not as a burden, but as a compass, and those who walked close would hear it too, would come to see that the kingdom he spoke of was not like any they had imagined, that it was rooted in the soil of surrender, watered by sacrifice, and shaped by silence that refused spectacle. And as the months unfolded and the rumors of his presence began to reach the ears of rulers and priests, Jesus walked on, still shaped by the desert, still held by the Father, still choosing each day to live the yes he had spoken long before the crowds came, a yes that would carry him all the way to the cross and beyond. As word of him began to spread, first like a whisper among fishermen, then like a murmur among market vendors, and finally as a name spoken with awe in synagogues and hushed excitement in streets, Jesus moved with a calm so profound it disturbed even the devout. For while others would have sought to ride the wave of recognition, to organize crowds and multiply their influence, he did not hasten his pace nor change his manner, but remained anchored in the quiet certainty born of 40 days beneath a silent sky. And this unsettled many, for the people, having long endured occupation and oppression, longed for a deliverer wrapped in strength, in spectacle, in thunder. And here was a man who walked slowly, who touched the untouchable, who wept over cities and rejoiced in the faith of foreigners, who taught not with fire and fury but with parables about seeds and shepherds. And though he healed the sick, cast out demons, and calmed storms, he did not proclaim these things with trumpet blasts or declare himself with titles. And the wilderness, which had stripped him of the temptation to prove, to seize, to dominate, continued to shape his ministry like the unseen wind that bends trees into strange and beautiful shapes. And the people could sense it, that he carried something they could not name, a gravity not of this world. And as the crowds gathered, pressing in from every direction, he often withdrew, slipping away into the hills or across the sea, not to flee but to remain rooted in the voice that had spoken before the crowds, to remember that the work of the Father was not measured by applause but by obedience. And so he moved from village to village, sometimes received with joy, sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with stones. And through it all, he did not harden, did not waver, but kept his heart open like the desert sky, exposed yet unshaken. And he spoke of the kingdom not as a future government, but as a present reality, not as conquest, but as presence, not in palaces, but in mustard seeds and hidden treasure. And those who followed him, tax collectors, former zealots, fishermen with rough hands and tender hearts, began to realize that walking with him was not a march to power, but a descent into mystery, into surrender, into the upside-down world of grace, where the first are last, and the poor are blessed, and the meek inherit what the mighty always miss. And he taught them, not just with words, but with silence, with his gaze, with his pauses. And the disciples, though slow to understand, could not deny the pull of his presence. For even when he said nothing, they felt as though heaven had spoken. And often, when they asked him about the signs, the people, the path ahead, he would answer not with strategy, but with story, not with plans, but with presence, reminding them that faith is not a destination, but a posture, not a ladder to climb, but a table to join. And they began to see that his strength came not from striving, but from surrender, from having faced every human impulse and said no until only the Father's will remained. And the wilderness, though behind him, was never far, for it had become his rhythm. Rise early, pray alone, listen deeply, speak sparingly, love radically. And this rhythm clashed with the pace of the world, with the urgency of the crowds, and yet it never faltered. And soon they would see that this rhythm would carry him even into Jerusalem, even into betrayal, even into the silence of death itself. And yet, here in these days of rising ministry, he remained fully present, healing the blind with clay and spit, lifting children onto his lap, sitting with sinners and shattering every barrier that men had built between themselves and God. And the religious elite, seeing this, grew restless, threatened not by spectacle, but by simplicity, not by power, but by purity. For they could not control what they could not comprehend, and they asked him for signs, demanded proof, but he refused to perform on command, refused to turn the Father's will into a circus act, and when he did speak, he spoke with such clarity, such authority, that the people were left stunned, not just by what he said, but by how he said it, as if the words had come not from scrolls, but from the space between the stars. And as he walked among them, he did not seem impressed by kings or shaken by demons or distracted by wealth, but moved with the same stillness he had cultivated in the wilderness, as if the desert still spoke beneath his breath, reminding him always of who he was and who he was not. And the people noticed this. They noticed that he was not like them, and yet somehow more human than any man they'd met. And when he prayed, it was not a ritual, but a reunion, not a performance, but a pouring out. And the disciples often found him alone, face to the earth, communing with the unseen. And though they did not fully understand, they began to imitate, to watch how he looked at people, how he touched with gentleness, how he never hurried. And in their imitation, something began to change, not just their behavior, but their being. And still he said, "Follow me," not into status or certainty, but into deeper dependence, into a love that would cost them everything, and yet give them life. And the wilderness within him became a kind of shelter around them. And though they would falter, though they would sleep when they should watch and flee when they should stand, he never stopped teaching them, never stopped loving them. And he knew the cross waited, that suffering loomed, that misunderstanding would turn to hatred, that cheers would become jeers. And yet still he walked, still he spoke, still he healed, because love, real love, is not discouraged by delay or derailed by resistance. And the wilderness had taught him that silence can be more powerful than speech, that surrender can be stronger than sword. And now he lived that truth with every breath. And so the Son of God walked among them, unnoticed by some, adored by others, feared by a few, but always unchanged, always surrendered, always steady. The silence of the desert, now walking in sandals, touching lepers, lifting the broken, speaking light into every dark place. The sun had reached its highest point in the sky, casting its relentless heat down upon the desert floor, where stones shimmered like hot coals, and the air itself seemed to pulse with quiet intensity. The days had begun to stretch like threads pulled taut across time, and the silence of the wilderness grew louder than ever. In this crucible of heat and hunger, time lost its familiar edges. There were no hours, no clocks, only the slow carving of sun and shadow across the rocks, and the unyielding presence of the divine watching over it all. Jesus sat beneath the sparse shade of a weather-worn outcrop, his eyes not focused on any one thing, but rather gazing into the vast stillness of it all. His body was weary, thin with fasting, yet within his frame was a presence as rooted as the mountains surrounding him. This was not a waiting filled with dread or desperation, but a holy stillness that had matured in him, formed through each breath, each step, each resistance against the lure of ease. The Spirit had not abandoned him. No, it remained like a low burning fire in his chest, a warmth that neither the chill of night nor the blaze of day could extinguish. But even within the Spirit's presence, the enemy's voice returned, this time not with overt demands or twisted scripture, but with the most subtle weapon of all, suggestion. The voice whispered not in command, but in inquiry, cloaked in concern, quiet as the wind that stirred the sand. What if your suffering is not necessary? It was not the voice of a roaring lion now, but of a serpent coiled beneath the surface, echoing the ancient temptation offered to Eve. It did not say, "Turn these stones to bread," or "Throw yourself down." No, it said, "Are you sure this is the way? Perhaps there's another, one with less pain, more acclaim. Surely the Father does not require this of you." And in that moment, Jesus closed his eyes and breathed deeply, not just air into lungs, but truth into soul. He remembered the stories passed down from mother to son, stories of deliverance, of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah, of Moses and the burning bush, of David alone before Goliath. He remembered the psalms sung beneath stars in his youth, the gentle cadence of Mary's voice, the strong embrace of Joseph, and the stirrings of purpose that had followed him since childhood, like a second shadow. He knew the path would not bend toward comfort. He knew his mission was not wrapped in applause, but in surrender. And still, the enemy persisted, not with arguments, but with images. Visions unspooled in his mind, a table rich with food, a crowd cheering his name, a throne not of thorns but of gold, a life unscarred by rejection or crucifixion, a kingdom without a cross. But even these illusions began to lose their shine when held against the radiant truth beating in his chest. For the Spirit had carved a knowing in him deeper than hunger or weariness, that obedience was the highest nourishment, that surrender was the truest strength, and that to follow the Father's will, even unto death, was to walk in the fullness of life. The enemy's images began to fade like smoke, exposed by the pure light of unshakable faith. And in their place came a deeper vision, not of worldly triumphs, but of hands reaching for healing, of eyes wet with mercy, of children running into open arms. A kingdom not of this world, yes, but of divine reversal, where the meek inherit, where the broken are lifted, where the last are first. And he saw himself walking among them, not as a ruler demanding loyalty, but as a shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. This vision brought tears to his eyes, for it was not abstract, it was love. Costly, unrelenting, real. And in that love, the wilderness began to shift, not in temperature or terrain, but in atmosphere. The loneliness did not vanish, but it no longer had dominion. The silence did not break, but it no longer echoed with doubt. For Jesus had answered not with words, but with being, with the still, unwavering posture of the soul aligned with heaven. The temptation was not silenced because he out-argued it, but because he outlasted it, because he stayed, because he believed that what was unseen was greater than what was offered. And as the afternoon passed into evening, the shadows stretched long across the desert floor like gentle arms reaching toward him. A breeze stirred through the rocks, and even the stones seemed to sigh in reverence. He stood slowly, the light tracing his figure, and walked once again, each step quiet, but each footfall proclaiming, "Not my will, but yours be done." It was not the end of trial, but it was the triumph of trust. And in that holy stillness, heaven drew closer, not in spectacle, but in nearness, not in rescue, but in recognition, that here stood the Son, hungry, tired, surrounded by nothing, and yet full of the Spirit, full of truth, full of the love that would carry him all the way to the cross and beyond. Night began its quiet descent once more, draping the wilderness in layers of soft blue and shadowed gold, as if the heavens themselves exhaled a lullaby over the earth. The sky, a vast sea of indigo velvet, welcomed the early stars, each one arriving like a memory, distant and pulsing, reminders that even in desolate places, light continues to speak. Jesus walked slowly along the ridgeline, each footfall deliberate on the uneven ground, his sandals coated in fine desert dust, his robe hanging loose around a body thinned by discipline and solitude. The cold came quickly after the sun dipped low, sharper now, a contrast to the heat that scorched his skin just hours before. But he did not shiver. His breath was steady, a rhythm learned through stillness, a cadence born not of comfort, but of endurance. Around him, the world was hushed. No animal stirred, no breeze whistled, only the faint crackle of distant rocks cooling from the day's burn. And in this stillness, another silence settled too. The silence after resistance, the calm that follows obedience, the peace that exists, not because all danger is gone, but because the heart has chosen whom it belongs to. Jesus found a smooth stone and sat, eyes lifted to the constellations above, their ancient patterns etched into the sky like scripture written by fire. These were the same stars Abraham once counted, the same canopy under which Jacob dreamed, the same sky the prophets studied in awe and trembling. They looked down on him now, not as a stranger to their story, but as its fulfillment. And as he sat beneath them, he whispered prayers not as one seeking answers, but as one drawing near in intimacy. His words were not loud, but they held the weight of eternity. "Father, I am yours," he murmured, the sound nearly swallowed by the air, yet echoed across time. Even now, especially now. It was not a plea for escape, nor a demand for signs, but a surrender so complete that it turned even waiting into worship. The wilderness, once a place of emptiness, now became a cathedral, not made of stone and stained glass, but of sand and stars and sacred resolve. And yet, even in this quiet communion, the adversary did not vanish completely. Temptation, like a shadow, returns in cycles, disguised, rephrased, more cunning with each approach. The enemy came again not to provoke hunger or question his identity, but to sow seeds of isolation. "You're alone," the whisper said, softer than ever. "And no one sees, no one understands. Not even the Father can feel this distance." And that suggestion, more than any command or false promise, held the sharpest edge. For it did not ask him to act, only to agree. To believe that distance meant abandonment. To believe that silence meant absence. And Jesus felt the ache of that thought, not as failure, but as humanity. It struck the most tender part of him, the desire to be seen, to be understood, to be held by the very one who had led him into this wilderness to begin with. But then came memory. Not imagination, not fantasy, but the deep-rooted memory of the Jordan, when heaven opened and the Father's voice rang out, "This is my beloved Son." That voice was not a dream. It was not a trick. It was truth. And even though it had been days since he heard it with his ears, it still thundered within him like a river under rock. The enemy could twist words, but he could not erase what had been spoken. The Father had claimed him in love, and love does not vanish in the dark. And so Jesus did what many do not. He did not argue with the lie. He did not dwell on the emptiness. He simply chose to remember. He turned his face to the stars and let the truth anchor him deeper than any feeling could sway. The night stretched on, and the moon rose slow and bright over the horizon, casting a soft silver sheen on the rocks around him. It was then that something subtle shifted, not outside, but within. A deep assurance settled into him, not as emotion, but as knowing. That faith was not the absence of wilderness, but the courage to keep walking through it. That the Father's presence was not proven by comfort, but by the very breath that still filled his lungs. That love does not always shout, but it never leaves. And as this assurance grew, so did his strength, not the kind measured in muscle, but in will, in devotion, in quiet fire. The wilderness had not won. The enemy had not overtaken. And though his body still bore the toll of the fast, his soul stood upright, clear-eyed, unshaken. He rose again, stretching his limbs slowly, letting the wind lift the edge of his robe like a priest preparing to step forward into sacred ground. And perhaps that's what this place had become. Not a prison of hardship, but a threshold of preparation. For in these 40 days, something had been forged, something invisible yet indestructible, a resolve that would carry him through rejection, betrayal, and even crucifixion. A clarity that would not be blurred by crowds crying Hosanna, or by those later shouting, Crucify. A vision that could see not just through time, but through pain. He began to walk again, each step leaving a faint impression in the sand, which the wind would soon erase, but not before heaven had recorded them. Angels, unseen yet ever near, hovered at the edges, their presence not yet revealed, waiting for the appointed moment to draw close. For even in his solitude, he was never abandoned. And though the enemy had exhausted his voice for now, he would return at a more opportune time, as shadows always do. But Jesus was not afraid. He knew what he carried. He knew who he was, and he knew whose he was. The wilderness was not punishment. It was preparation. And as he moved deeper into the night, toward the final stretch of his fast, he did so not as one breaking beneath the weight, but as one rising into purpose. The stars bore witness, the earth held its breath, and the heavens waited, because something holy was unfolding, one step at a time. Dawn did not break with fanfare, nor did it burst upon the world like a sudden fire. It crept in gently, brushing its golden fingers across the horizon, stirring the rim of the earth with promise. The shadows began to retreat, not in fear, but in reverence, and the first light of morning shimmered against the sands like a whisper of mercy. Jesus stood once more atop a rise of craggy stone, his figure still and unwavering, a silhouette painted in gold and pale blue, facing the eastern sky as if in quiet welcome of what was to come. The air was cool but not cold, touched with the scent of stone, silence, and something more, something sacred that hovered just out of reach, like a song half remembered or a name too holy to speak aloud. His eyes, though tired, bore the steady gleam of one who has walked through fire and come out refined, not scorched. 40 days had begun to etch themselves into his very frame, not as weakness, but as testimony. His ribs now shadowed beneath his skin. His hair caught the morning light like threads of burnished bronze, and his hands, once soft, from carpentry and water jars, now bore the quiet calluses of the wilderness. Yet there was a light in him, deeper than the sun, deeper than the heavens stretching overhead, a light not made from sight, but from surrender. And in that surrender, something remarkable had happened. The hunger, though present, no longer ruled him. The solitude, though long, no longer isolated him. Even temptation, though persistent, had lost its grip. For he had not escaped the desert by force. He had endured it by faith. And now, as the final days approached, he did not count down the time in desperation, but received each hour as a gift, a sacred page in the scroll of his preparation. As he walked, his feet traced paths known only to him and the Father, paths worn by wandering prophets, by shepherds and kings, by those who had come before and longed to see what he now carried. Every rock beneath his sandal, every thorn brushing his robe, seemed to remember the one who walked among them. Eden's echo, Abraham's promise, Moses' cry for deliverance, David's whispered psalms, all now converging in the steps of the Son. But still, the journey was not easy. The fatigue pulled at his shoulders like invisible hands. The dry air scratched his throat with every breath. And yet his gaze remained lifted, focused not on relief, but on revelation. For he was not merely waiting for the wilderness to end. He was allowing it to shape him, carve him, ready him, not because he lacked clarity, but because clarity forged in suffering is unshakable. As he paused beneath a lone acacia tree, his twisted limbs reaching toward the sky like prayers frozen in wood, he let the silence wash over him again. No crowds clamored, no voices praised. There were no comforts here, no distractions, only presence, only purpose. And it was here, in the solitude, that he heard it, not in sound, but in soul, a deep reminder, soft and ancient. You are my beloved Son. In you I am well pleased. The same words spoken at the river, now echoing in the stillness like a heartbeat beneath the surface of all things. They had not faded with time. They had only grown louder in the silence. And he held them now, not as distant encouragement, but as lifeblood. They were the truth that tethered him, the compass that never shifted, the voice that did not accuse, but affirmed. And it was then, as he sat at the base of the tree, with eyes closed and spirit still, that the enemy returned, not with roar or threat, but with a familiar softness. This time, the temptation was dressed not in dramatic tests, but in logic, in suggestion, in reason. You've proved enough, it whispered. You've endured. Why carry on? It was not an attack. It was a proposition, a gentle nudge to stop short, to claim the victory prematurely, to settle for something just shy of complete obedience. But Jesus knew that compromise dressed as wisdom is still compromise. He knew that the road of faith does not end in almost. It presses on, even when every nerve screams for rest. He knew that the cross awaiting him would not require mere endurance, but full surrender. And this wilderness was his rehearsal. The battle here would shape the posture of his soul in Gethsemane. And so, he did not rise quickly or respond with grand declarations. He simply stayed rooted in truth, stayed firm in silence, stayed held by the presence that had never once abandoned him. The enemy, unmet by fear or faltering, faded again, undone not by resistance but by radiant peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come after the battle, but during it. A peace born not of circumstance, but of knowing whose footsteps you walk in. The sun crept higher, casting long shadows over the rocks, and Jesus opened his eyes once more. In them burned the flame of a calling so profound that the desert itself seemed to bow in reverence. He stood slowly, shoulders squared, not in defiance, but in devotion. The fast was not yet finished, but he was no longer empty. He was filled with something the world could not take. Assurance, alignment, authority born of humility. And as he stepped forward, the earth did not tremble, but heaven did lean close. Angels watched. The Spirit hovered, and the Father smiled, not because his Son had performed, but because his Son had obeyed. The desert would not remember his name, but eternity would. Not for the miracles that would follow, not for the words that would be spoken, but for this. for the quiet yes, given again and again when no one was watching. This was the beginning of redemption, sown in soil that looked barren to human eyes, but was fertile with divine purpose. And as the winds stirred once more and the sun crowned the sky, Jesus walked on, deeper into the wilderness, but never lost. Each step a sacred echo of a love that would one day walk up a hill called Calvary. The days had become a soft blur of sunrises and sunsets, the desert marking time not with clocks, but with shifting light and the faithful sweep of stars across the heavens. Jesus, now deep in the rhythm of the wilderness, moved with a stillness that no longer strained. His hunger, though profound, had begun to speak less of lack and more of clarity. His body, though gaunt, moved with quiet steadiness, each step purposeful, each breath a prayer breathed in rhythm with the desert's own slow cadence. The silence no longer felt like absence. It had become its own kind of company. The rustle of wind against stones, the creak of ancient trees bending in the breeze, the distant call of a solitary bird. These were his companions now, joining him in this long vigil of preparation. And the desert, once harsh and foreign, had become something strangely familiar. Not a home, but a crucible. Not a destination, but a mirror. And in its raw, exposed terrain, everything unnecessary had been stripped away. Every imagined need, every whisper of ego, every comfortable illusion had fallen to the ground like dead leaves. What remained was only what could endure fire, obedience, love, trust. And as Jesus walked beneath the rising heat of the day, the ground cracked with age and the sun shimmered against the horizon, the enemy returned once more, not with storm, not with spectacle, but with suggestion so subtle it was barely distinguishable from one's own thoughts. This time the voice did not tempt him with bread, nor call him to prove himself. It came instead in the form of a question wrapped in care. What if this is all there is? The voice was low, thoughtful, almost tender. What if the people never understand? What if they turn away? What if the road ahead leads only to suffering? It was not the lie of grandeur this time. It was the lie of futility, the kind that asks not for failure, but for weariness, the kind that does not challenge his calling, but his hope, the kind that tries to chip away at joy, leaving obedience hollow and heavy. And for a moment, Jesus felt the weight of it, not because he doubted the Father, but because he carried the burden of the world's blindness. He could already see the faces of those who would walk away when the teaching grew hard, already hear the disappointment in the voices of those who wanted a warrior, not a servant. He could feel the ache of knowing that love, even divine love, would be met with betrayal. That healing would not always bring gratitude. That truth would not always be welcomed with open arms. And still, he did not recoil. He did not rage. He simply let the ache pass through him like the wind, without building a house for it to live in. For even if none followed, even if every miracle was misunderstood, even if the road led only to a cross, he would still walk it, not because of the outcome, but because of the one who sent him. Because faithfulness was never about applause, it was about love, and love is never wasted. He paused at the edge of a dried riverbed, the soil cracked and white, and knelt to touch the earth. His fingers sifted the dust that once carried water, proof that even in places where life seems gone, the memory of it lingers. And just as this river had once flowed, so too would the Spirit continue to move, unseen perhaps, but unceasing. He could feel it even now, the quiet presence hovering, never gone, never distant. The enemy's voice may suggest abandonment, But the Father's silence was not absence. It was intimacy too deep for words. And Jesus, the Word made flesh, understood the language of that silence. He stood once more, his shadow stretching long behind him in the late afternoon light. The sun's descent painted the sky in tones of amber and fire, and the wind lifted the hem of his robe, as if even the elements bowed in reverence to the one who bore the weight of redemption without complaint. The wilderness, though it had stripped him, had also revealed him, not only to the watching heavens, but to himself. For here, away from every comfort, every crown, every voice of praise or protest, he had seen himself reflected in the quiet gaze of the Father, and he was not afraid, not of the suffering, not of the solitude, not of the mission ahead. Because when all is removed and only love remains, fear has no foothold. That evening, as darkness wrapped itself again around the hills like a cloak, Jesus sat upon a stone and watched the stars awaken, first one, then another, until the sky was alive with the quiet music of ancient light. And for a long time, he simply watched, letting their beauty wash over him, not as distraction, but as a reminder that the same hand that formed these stars had formed him, that the same breath that spoke them into being had spoken over him. You are my beloved Son. That even now, even in a desert forgotten by men, heaven remembered, and slowly, in the dark, he began to hum a melody, low, ancient, wordless. Perhaps one Mary had sung over him as a child. Perhaps one David had whispered to sheep beneath a Bethlehem sky. It was not a song of triumph, but of trust, a lullaby of surrender, a hymn for the road ahead. And the angels, hidden among the cliffs and wind, listened with reverence, for this was the sound of victory not yet seen, of redemption already unfolding, of a Saviour being prepared not through conquest, but through consecration. The desert slept around him, but he remained awake, not anxious, but attuned. For each moment, each breath, each whisper of temptation overcome, was a thread in the tapestry of salvation. And as he closed his eyes beneath the vast heavens, the Father watched, not with distance, but with delight. Not because the wilderness had ended, but because his Son had remained. The final stretch of days unfolded like parchment under firelight, fragile, curling at the edges, and yet holding something eternal within. The wind had become a familiar companion now, brushing across the wilderness with long, sighing exhales that moved through rock and valley, as if nature itself mourned and rejoiced in rhythm with him. Jesus rose slowly in the early morning, bones aching not from frailty, but from the steady erosion of all that was unneeded. The fast had thinned his body to its barest necessity, but his spirit stood stronger than the mountains around him, steadier than the earth beneath his feet. This desert had not devoured him, it had refined him. And now, as the end of his 40 days approached, the silence that once rang with temptation now hummed with expectancy. Every moment, every footfall felt layered with meaning, as if creation was leaning forward, breath held, waiting for what would come next. He walked toward the ridges where the rocks cast long shadows and the sun spilled golden over the desert's bones. The vast expanse around him no longer felt like emptiness. It felt sacred, hollowed out by trial and filled with presence. Here, there were no distractions, no illusions, only truth that burned gently and without end. And the truth was this: he had not been alone, not once. The spirit that had led him here had never withdrawn. The Father's love had not flickered in silence. Even in the moments when temptation whispered and the night stretched long with cold, he had never been abandoned. And now, that awareness sat inside him like a second heart, pulsing with quiet confidence. Still, the adversary came again, as he always did. Not in thunder, not in spectacle, but in stillness, slipping in like a shadow stretched across the light. He appeared as one who understood suffering, as one who spoke with concern. "You are weary, Jesus. Your fast is near its end. Why should you suffer one moment longer? If you are the Son of God, why not command these stones to become bread? Not for show, not for pride, but for survival." The voice was gentle now, reasonable, even tender, as if a friend. And in that voice lay the temptation not of pride or power, but of self-preservation. The oldest pull, the first fracture, to meet one's own need before fulfilling one's purpose, to reach for comfort at the cost of calling. But Jesus did not answer immediately. He looked down at the stones, weathered, ancient, unchanged. And then he looked upward toward the sky that had watched over him for weeks, the same sky that hovered over Bethlehem's fields and Galilee's waters and would one day darken at the sound of his last breath. And in that moment, he knew this was not just about bread, it was about trust. Would he trust the Father to sustain him to the end? Or would he step outside the will of heaven to secure what seemed justifiable? He closed his eyes, feeling the hunger gnaw at his ribs, and still, he did not yield. For his hunger was real, but his obedience was more real still. And so he answered, not with argument, but with scripture spoken like breath. "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." It was not defiance, it was declaration, a reminder to the enemy and to his own human frame that life itself flows not from food or comfort, but from communion, from the words spoken before time, from the voice that split seas and formed stars and whispered over him at the river. That voice had not fallen silent. It still nourished him even now. And so he turned from the stones, leaving them untouched, their silence echoing his resolve. The enemy did not vanish, but withdrew for a moment, circling, shifting, reshaping, as temptation often does. Jesus continued walking deeper into the desert, where the terrain turned harsher and the winds sharper, yet his heart was unshaken. For every trial now seemed like an echo of a larger story. Each test in the wilderness mirrored the tests that had echoed through Israel's history: the hunger, the thirst, the waiting, the doubt. And he, the true Israel, was succeeding where others had stumbled. Not by force, but by faith. Not by might, but by surrender. He reached a high place and stood upon a ledge overlooking the vast, breathless expanse. From here, the world seemed both near and impossibly distant. Cities flickered in the far haze. Rivers wound like veins through distant valleys. Kingdoms shimmered like glass just beyond reach. And once again, the adversary appeared, this time clothed in grandeur. "Look," he said, voice low and velvety, "all of it can be yours. Every nation, every crown, every tongue. No pain, no blood, no cross. Just bow, just once, and I will give you everything." The offer glittered with promise. Expedited glory, painless power, the worship of nations without the suffering of the cross. But Jesus, eyes clear and heart full, did not move. He saw through it all, saw the lie behind the luster, saw that worship bought by compromise is not worship at all. It is captivity. And in that moment, he knew that the enemy did not fear miracles or crowds or teachings. He feared obedience, quiet, relentless obedience to the will of the Father. That was what unraveled the kingdom of darkness. That was what would redeem the world. And so Jesus answered with words forged in wilderness, carved in resolve. "Away from me, Satan. For it is written, 'Worship the Lord your God, and serve him only.'" With that, the air changed, the illusion broke, the adversary fled, not because he was shouted down, but because he was resisted with truth and unwavering trust. And as silence reclaimed the mountain, something stirred in the unseen. Light descended like morning dew. The veil between earth and heaven thinned. And then they came, angels, radiant and real, not in spectacle, but in service. They moved toward him not as royalty, but as caretakers of one who had passed through fire. They did not speak. They ministered. Bread appeared, not conjured, but provided. Water touched his lips, not as relief, but as fulfillment. They tended to him with reverence, as if the dust on his feet was sacred, as if every scar of hunger was worthy of awe. And he received it all, not with greed, but with grace. The fast was ending. The desert had not broken him. It had revealed him. And the one who emerged now stood not just as a teacher, not just as a prophet, but as the Lamb who had carried the weight of the world, not with violence, but with love. And as the wind quieted and the stars blinked their last before the morning, Jesus turned his face toward the path ahead. Galilee waited. The Jordan Valley waited. Gethsemane waited. The cross waited. And so did the empty tomb. But for now, there was only the last breath of the wilderness, the final hush before the mission began. The final dawn of the 40 days rose not with fanfare, but with a soft, sacred stillness, as if the earth itself had paused to take a breath before the world shifted forever. A low golden light seeped over the desert hills, casting long, gentle shadows across the rocks and sand that had borne witness to the shaping of a soul. The wilderness no longer looked barren. It looked holy. It had become an altar, each stone a silent testament to obedience. Each dry valley a place where surrender was offered and trust refined. Jesus stood alone, yet not lonely, at the crest of a sunlit ridge, his silhouette framed by the rising day. His robes clung to his frame, light and loose from the long fast, but he did not sway. His steps were steady, his hands open, and his gaze held something weightless yet anchored, like a man who had met himself fully and come through. The silence of the desert was no longer heavy. It was reverent, not the quiet of absence, but the hush of awe. Creation itself seemed to exhale around him, the sand breathing beneath his feet, the wind circling gently as though to say, "It is finished here." But even in this completion, there was no rest, only readiness. This was not the end of trial, but the beginning of mission. The stillness he now carried would follow him into noise, into crowds, into cities filled with brokenness and hunger and disbelief. And he was ready, not because he had conquered the wilderness in strength, but because he had surrendered to it in fullness. For 40 days, he had stripped away every illusion, every worldly support, every comfort, and in that emptiness discovered the invincible presence of the Father. The whispers of temptation had come again and again, like waves against stone, but they had found no foothold in him, not because he was untouched by desire or suffering, but because he had chosen trust again and again, even when no one saw, even when there was no applause. That choice had become a foundation now, a quiet fire in his bones that no fear could quench and no flattery could manipulate. And so, as the last morning of the wilderness opened before him, he did not look back with dread. He looked back with reverence. Each grain of sand beneath his feet felt sacred now, as though it too had carried some part of the divine tension between hunger and fulfillment, between temptation and truth. His final steps through the desert were not heavy. They were weightless, carried by the unseen strength of one who knows he has already overcome. He moved through the narrowing paths of rock and brush with the ease of familiarity, the desert no longer strange, but known. He paused now and then, touching the rough bark of a lone tree, or letting his fingers graze the edge of a stone that had once been the object of temptation. But he did not linger. He did not mourn what had been endured. He had no need to revisit what had already been redeemed. And as he came to a wide plateau where the sun kissed the earth with its full embrace, he stopped and stood in the open, arms loose at his sides, heart full. Here, at the threshold between wilderness and world, he let the moment wash over him, not as one returning from exile, but as one emerging from consecration. There was no crowd to receive him, no voice from the clouds, no trumpet, only the quiet sense that the time had come. The silence around him was no longer a test, it was a benediction. He breathed in deeply, the air dry but welcome in his lungs. His body still ached from the fast, but his spirit did not waver. He had passed through trial not untouched, but unshaken. And now, as the Spirit moved again within him, like the breath of the first creation stirring in dust, he turned toward the horizon, toward the villages of Galilee, toward the synagogues, toward the sick, the lepers, the forgotten, toward the ones who would follow and the ones who would betray, toward the road that would wind beneath palms and later beneath the weight of a cross, toward the will of the Father, unfolding not in flashes, but in footsteps. And the footsteps began here, the first steps of ministry, the first of many days among the people, among the questions, among the wounds and needs of humankind. The voice of the tempter was gone now, for a time, driven not by force but by fidelity, and in its place there was only the steady whisper of heaven. Go, not shouted, not demanded, just spoken in the language of peace. Go into the towns, go into the hearts of the weary, go because love must now become visible. And so he did. He walked from the desert not with spectacle, but with substance, not in haste, but in quiet conviction. The angels did not accompany him visibly, but their presence remained, woven into the air like incense after a sacrifice. They had ministered. To him not to rescue, but to affirm, to say he is ready. And he was. Ready to be misunderstood, ready to be poured out, ready to teach not only with words, but with wounds. The wilderness had not taken from him, it had revealed him, not only to the unseen realm, but to himself. The Son of God had entered hungry and emerged whole. The Lamb of God had entered alone and emerged anointed. The teacher had entered in silence and emerged with the thunder of truth resting in his chest. And the wilderness, having given all it came to give, faded into the background like a chapter completed. It did not need to be carried forward, for what mattered had already been carved into his soul. As the sun climbed fully into the sky and the heat began to rise, Jesus stepped down from the plateau and began his descent. His footprints trailed behind him in the dust, soft but certain. And though the world did not yet know it, every step carried redemption. Every movement bore mercy. Every breath, from now until Golgotha, would be saturated with obedience. This was how the kingdom would come. Not with armies, not with thunder, but with sandals worn thin, hands stretched wide, and a love that refused to turn away, even in the wilderness.